And let's bring in someone who knows well what the Guthrie family is facing right now, Ed Smart, whose daughter Elizabeth was abducted from their Salt Lake City home in 2002 at the age of 14. She was held captive for 9 months.
They found blood on her porch, a masked stranger on her camera, and then nothing. Nancy Guthrie vanished without a single trace, and for days, nobody had any answers. Her daughter Savannah stood before the entire country, completely broken, begging for her mother's life.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember, once you have the initial shock, but it never goes away. And, at night you wonder, where is she? How is she surviving? What should I be doing to find her? And that just repeats over and over in your mind. I remember.
But what investigators just uncovered has changed absolutely everything. And when Savannah finally opened her mouth and spoke, nobody was ready for what came out. This is the detail that has the whole nation in shock. Nancy Guthrie is not a name that most people outside of Arizona would have known before the events of early 2026. She was a private person, living quietly in the foothills north of Tucson, known to her neighbours for her warmth and to her friends for her reliability. But in the span of a single night, her name became the centre of one of the most closely followed missing persons cases the United States had seen in years. To understand what happened, it helps to start at the beginning, not with the disappearance itself, but with the woman and the family behind it. Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is well known to American television audiences as a co-anchor on NBC's Today Show. But long before the cameras and the career, there was simply a family trying to hold itself together through loss. Savannah was born in Australia in 1971, where her father Charles was working at the time as a mining engineer. It was an unconventional start for someone who would later become one of the most recognizable faces in American broadcast journalism, but the family eventually made their way back to the United States and settled in Arizona. That is where Savannah truly grew up, and where much of who she became was shaped. By most accounts, Charles Guthrie was a significant presence in the lives of his children. Savannah has spoken about him publicly on more than one occasion, describing him as someone who could be both commanding and deeply caring. He was tall, funny, and known for his storytelling. The kind of father who could make even the most unremarkable afternoon feel like something worth remembering. He had strong values, and those values left a lasting impression on his children in ways that continued to show up throughout their lives. That presence was taken away suddenly in 1988. Charles died of a heart attack, and Savannah was just 16 years old at the time. It was the kind of loss that does not simply pass with time. It changes the shape of everything that follows. The family had to reorganize itself around an absence that could not be filled, and Nancy stepped into that gap completely. By all accounts, Nancy Guthrie handled the years after her husband's death with a steadiness that her children have never stopped talking about. She raised 3 kids on her own, and she did it without making a public display of the difficulty involved. Savannah has been direct about this in interviews, saying that everything good that came after her father's death has its roots in how her mother chose to respond to grief. Nancy did not let it define the family's story. She kept moving forward, kept her children close, and gave them a foundation that held. That closeness was visible in the choices the children made in the years that followed. When Savannah enrolled at the University of Arizona, her sister Annie did the same. The two of them quietly arranged their lives so that one of them would be home most weekends, making sure their mother was not left alone. It was never a formal agreement, just something they both understood and acted on. That kind of loyalty tends to speak louder than anything said out loud. Nancy herself had always spoken positively about life in Tucson. She lived in the Catalina Hills area, in the foothills beneath the Santa Catalina Mountains. It's a part of the city known more for hiking trails and quiet desert evenings than for anything troubling. She had mentioned in passing how much she enjoyed watching javelinas wander through her garden. For anyone unfamiliar with the American Southwest, javelinas are wild, pig-like animals that are a fairly common sight in desert neighborhoods around Tucson. Nancy found them more amusing than alarming, which says something about how settled and comfortable she felt in her surroundings. That sense of calm is part of what made what happened so difficult for people to process. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has described the Catalina Hills area as a neighborhood associated with outdoor recreation, not with violent crime or abductions. The The idea that something could go this wrong in that particular setting landed hard on the people who knew the area and the people who lived there. The last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie by her family was on the evening of Saturday, the 31st of January. There was nothing unusual about the night. She had gone to her daughter Annie's home for dinner and a family game night. It was the kind of gathering that happens between close families all the time, nothing planned around any particular occasion, just an evening together. She arrived at Annie's house at 5:32 in the afternoon, having taken an Uber from her home. Investigators later confirmed that the driver was fully cleared of any involvement and had cooperated with the investigation, providing dash cam footage that showed Nancy inside the vehicle. After several hours with the family, Nancy was driven home by relatives. She was dropped off at approximately 9:45 in the evening. The area where she lived sits behind winding roads and saguaro cacti, tucked away in a part of the foothills where homes tend to sit at a distance from one another. According to Sheriff Chris Nanos of the Pima County Sheriff's Department, investigators were able to establish a precise sequence of events for those final minutes. At 9:48 in the evening, Nancy's garage door opened. 2 minutes later, at 9:50, it closed. At that point, both her family and law enforcement believe she was safely inside for the night. What happened in the hours that followed is the question that would go on to drive the entire investigation. In the early hours of Sunday morning, the first signs that something was wrong began to appear, though nobody knew it yet. At 1:47 in the morning, Nancy's doorbell camera was disconnected. Sheriff Nanos confirmed later that the camera had been physically removed, though he was careful not to say it had been destroyed. Roughly 25 minutes after that, at 2:12 in the morning, surveillance software detected movement at the property. It was the kind of detail that should have helped investigators immediately, but it quickly became a source of frustration instead. The camera itself was never recovered, and because Nancy did not have an active subscription on the device, the software had not been storing any recordings. Whatever was captured in those moments was simply gone. The most striking piece of technical evidence came from an unexpected source. Nancy Guthrie had a pacemaker, and the app connected to it was being tracked as part of the investigation. According to Sheriff Nanos, the pacemaker app disconnected from her mobile phone at exactly 2:28 in the morning. Her phone was later found inside the house, undisturbed. Investigators have suggested that this detail may represent the moment she was moved far enough from the device for the connection to drop. It is a clinical piece of data, but in context it carries significant weight. The following morning, Nancy did not show up to a regular Sunday gathering. Contrary to some early reporting, she had not been attending church services in person for some time, a routine that had changed during the pandemic and never returned to what it was before. Instead, she had a standing arrangement with a small group of friends. Each Sunday, they would meet at one of their homes and watch a live-streamed church service together. The service they typically watched was based in New York, the same one attended by her daughter Savannah. Nancy never missed these get-togethers. So when Sunday morning came and she failed to appear, her friends noticed immediately. One of them contacted Annie to check on her, and that call set everything in motion. By 11:56 in the morning, relatives arrived at Nancy's home and found that she was not there. 7 minutes later, at 12:03 in the afternoon, the family called 911. Deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene by 12:15. The timeline from that point moved quickly. Savannah Guthrie was in the middle of preparing for a significant professional commitment at the time. She had been due to fly to Italy the following day to lead NBC's coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympics. She had spent the weekend at home with her husband and children, knowing she would soon be away. The phone call informing her that her mother was missing cut through all of that. People close to Savannah described it as the worst phone call she had ever received. She immediately began making arrangements to travel to Tucson. By Sunday afternoon, investigators had already concluded that this was not a straightforward missing persons case. Sheriff Nanos received a text message describing the condition of Nancy's home, and the description was enough to concern him immediately. He later said publicly that it was disturbing enough that he chose not to repeat it. Acting on that instinct, he called in homicide detectives and search and rescue teams. As those resources came together on the scene, deputies found the first physical piece of evidence: blood on the front porch of the home. Testing later confirmed it belonged to Nancy, though the quantity was described as minimal. Additional items from the property were sent to the lab for analysis, and authorities made clear they were actively pursuing new leads rather than simply waiting on results. Questions arose quickly about whether there had been a forced entry into the home, Sheriff Tito. Nanos did not confirm or deny it and expressed some uncertainty about where the speculation had come from. From the very beginning, he said, the department had been consistent on that point. It was not something they were prepared to discuss publicly. The timing of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance could not have come at a more difficult moment for her daughter. Savannah Guthrie had been preparing to fly to Italy to anchor NBC's coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympics, one of the most significant assignments of her professional calendar. Instead, she was on a plane to Tucson, sitting with the uncertainty of not knowing where her mother was or what had happened to her. The contrast between those two realities, the planned and the sudden, is part of what made the opening days of the investigation feel so disorienting for everyone following it. When Savannah arrived, she found a situation that was already being treated with a level of seriousness that left little room for reassurance. Chris Nanos had called in homicide detectives based on a description of the home's condition that he later said was too disturbing to repeat publicly. Search and rescue teams had been deployed. Blood had been found on the front porch, confirmed through testing to be Nancy's, though the amount was described as small. The house itself had been examined carefully, and additional items had been taken away for laboratory analysis. Investigators made clear from early on that they were not sitting and waiting, they were moving. As the days passed, the investigation expanded outward in several directions at once. Detectives were working through physical evidence, pursuing leads from the public, and trying to build a clearer picture of the hours between Nancy's arrival home on the Saturday night and the moment her family found her missing on the Sunday morning. That window, roughly 12 hours, remained frustratingly opaque. The doorbell camera had been removed. The surveillance software had detected movement but saved nothing. The pacemaker app had gone silent at 2:28 in the morning. Beyond those data points, the picture was incomplete. Then, on the third day of the search, the case shifted into new and more complicated territory. Ransom notes began to surface. They were not sent to the Guthrie family directly, which immediately raised questions. Instead, they were delivered to media organizations, both national and local. At least 3 separate messages were received, including one sent to TMZ and to Tucson-based television stations. Each message demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin in exchange for Nancy's safe return. Federal investigators flagged almost immediately that the same message had been sent to multiple outlets, which is not consistent with how genuine ransom communications typically work. The FBI confirmed that they could not verify whether the notes were authentic or whether they were the work of someone attempting to exploit the situation for attention or financial gain. What made the uncertainty worse was that the Guthrie family themselves had not received any direct communication from anyone claiming to be holding Nancy. Despite the very public demands, there had been no private contact, no instructions directed at the people who actually had the means and the motivation to respond. The opening line of the ransom message attracted widespread attention. It claimed that Nancy was okay, but frightened. It was a statement designed to suggest the sender had knowledge of her condition, but it was paired with no evidence, no photograph, and no way for the family to respond. There was no contact method included in the note, no channel through which anyone could reach back. The family was left in a position of complete helplessness, waiting for a next step from someone who may not have been who they claimed to be. Authorities confirmed that the notes referenced 2 specific items, an Apple Watch and a floodlight, though investigators declined to release the full contents of either message. The mention of those items suggested the sender had some familiarity with the property or with details of the case, but it was not enough to confirm that Nancy was actually in their custody. No proof of life was provided with either message. No follow-up demands were sent through any private channel. The deadlines included in at least one version of the letter, reportedly set for 5 o'clock in the afternoon on February the 5th and again on February the 9th, added pressure without adding clarity. Investigators noted that the notes did not even specify which time zone those deadlines referred to. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the authenticity of the messages, the FBI was clear that they were taking the threats seriously. They also issued a direct warning to anyone who might be considering sending false communications or attempting to impersonate those responsible. The message was straightforward. This kind of interference would be treated as a criminal matter, and those involved would be identified and held accountable. That warning proved to have teeth. A man in Los Angeles was arrested after sending messages to the Guthrie family asking about the Bitcoin referenced in the ransom demands. Federal authorities clarified that his messages were not connected to the original notes. It appeared to be a separate attempt to take advantage of a family already under enormous strain. On February the 4th, 4 days after Nancy disappeared, Savannah Guthrie appeared in a video posted to social media alongside her siblings Annie and Cameron. It was a difficult watch. The strain of the previous 4 days was visible on all three of them. Savannah spoke directly and without any attempt to soften the edges of the situation. She asked for proof, clear and undeniable, that her mother was still alive. She urged whoever was responsible to make contact, to open some kind of communication. She explained that Nancy lived with constant pain and depended on daily medication to manage her health. The implication was clear. Time was a factor. Every day that passed without contact was a day that increased the risk. Savannah had by this point stepped away from her role covering the Winter Olympics entirely. She ended the video by speaking directly to her mother, promising that her children would not stop until they found her. That same evening, investigators returned to the Guthrie property. Crime scene tape appeared around the house and was later removed. No official explanation was given for the visit, and the lack of information left the public and the media filling in the gaps with speculation. The activity was visible enough to suggest something had prompted a return to the scene, but authorities offered nothing concrete. The case had by this point drawn the attention of the highest levels of government. The president called Savannah personally to offer support and later announced publicly that federal law enforcement had been directed to commit every available resource to the investigation. The statement was notable not just for its content, but for its tone. This was being treated as a matter of national concern. As the first ransom deadline passed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Cameron Guthrie posted his own message online. He spoke directly to whoever was holding his mother, acknowledging that the family had heard nothing and had no way to reach them. Without contact, he said, there was no path forward. The family was asking for a line of communication, anything at all that would allow them to respond. Behind the scenes, the investigative infrastructure around the case was growing. The FBI formally joined forces with the Pima County Sheriff's Department, and together they announced a reward of $50,000 for any information leading to Nancy's recovery or to the arrest of those responsible. Additional law enforcement resources were brought in from across the region. Officials consistently emphasized that this was a coordinated effort involving both local and federal agencies working in parallel, not separately. The question of whether Mexican authorities had been contacted came up during this period, given Arizona's proximity to the border. Sheriff Nanos addressed it directly, confirming that no such communication had taken place. While he had regular working relationships with international consulates as part of his broader responsibilities, none had reached out in connection with this case, and there was no indication at that stage of any cross-border involvement. Investigators made one more public appeal during this stretch of the investigation, and it was deliberately personal in its framing. They asked anyone involved in Nancy's disappearance to come forward and do the right thing. They described her not in terms of the case or the headlines, but as an elderly grandmother who needed her medication and who was running out of time. The appeal was simple and human, and it was clearly aimed at anyone on the periphery of what had happened who might be weighing up whether to speak. The case then took a further and more troubling turn. A local CNN affiliate in Tucson reported receiving what appeared to be a second message connected to the disappearance. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Office released a joint statement confirming they were reviewing the information to assess its credibility. They gave little away in terms of detail, but the fact that a joint statement was issued at all indicated how seriously the communication was being treated. What emerged about the second message made it stand apart from the first. The news director at one of the local stations explained that neither message had included any proof that Nancy was still alive. While the first note had claimed she was doing fine, the tone of the second message was noticeably different. It did not ask for money. It did not follow the structure of a conventional ransom demand. Instead of including a photograph, the sender had written only a description of Nancy, seemingly as a way of suggesting they were the same person behind the first message. The most alarming element of the second note was its reference to consequences if a deadline was not met. When investigators were asked directly whether that implied a threat to Nancy's life, the answer was not reassuring. A local CBS affiliate also confirmed it had received a message related to the case. The station did not share specifics publicly, but handed over everything it had to law enforcement, including technical data pointing to where the message had originated. The content was described as sensitive, though it did not contain a specific deadline. As night fell, the activity at Nancy's property became more visible. Detectives in gloves spread across the yard. Evidence markers appeared in multiple locations. Investigators searched through bushes, examined the ground, and climbed onto the roof of the property. A vehicle believed to be connected to Nancy was towed away, suggesting investigators were broadening their focus and returning to aspects of the case they may have already examined once before. 1 week after Nancy vanished, her 3 children released another video. Savannah spoke to the camera and acknowledged that the family had received a message and understood what it was asking. She said that bringing their mother home was the only outcome that would give any of them peace. The video ended with a statement that the family was willing to pay, though no specific figures were mentioned. According to people familiar with the investigation, the video was a direct and deliberate response to the second message received earlier that day. The following morning, investigators shifted their attention to Annie Guthrie's home, where Nancy had spent her last evening before disappearing. Detectives were seen leaving the property carrying evidence bags. The timing drew comments from forensic analysts observing the case publicly. One pointed out that collecting evidence from that location so late in the process was concerning, noting that electronic data and security footage can be overwritten or lost if not preserved quickly. Every hour, he said, risked the permanent loss of something that might otherwise have helped. At nearly 11 in the morning on February the 8th, investigators returned to Nancy's home with their attention focused on the septic tank. They were seen using flashlights and a long probe to examine beneath the surface. Authorities confirmed only that detectives and federal agents were conducting follow-up work at several locations and offered no further comment. Meanwhile, more details emerged about the demands contained in at least one of the notes sent to media outlets. The figure being demanded was $6 million. The ultimatum attached to it was stark. If the money was not delivered by 5 o'clock in the afternoon on February the 9th, Nancy's life would be in danger. With that deadline now close, Savannah returned to social media just after 1:30 in the afternoon. She was visibly shaken. She told the public directly that the family was at a point of desperation and needed help. She said they believed her mother was still alive and that law enforcement was working without pause to bring her home. She asked anyone with even the smallest piece of information to come forward, no matter how insignificant it might seem. By this point, the FBI had established a 24-hour command post, staffed with crisis negotiators and investigative teams. Officials confirmed that no suspect or person of interest had been identified and that there had been no direct communication between the family and anyone claiming responsibility. The Sheriff's Department acknowledged they had no suspect description and no vehicle information to release. A spokesperson asked for patience, promising that a press briefing would be called immediately if a significant development occurred. In the meantime, a visible law enforcement presence would remain at the Guthrie residences. One thing officials were willing to highlight was the response from the public. Thousands of tips had come in through multiple channels. Teams of investigators were working through every single one of them. In a case defined by uncertainty and unanswered questions, that volume of public attention had become one of the few things anyone could point to with any kind of confidence. On the morning of February the 10th, just after 11 o'clock, the investigation reached a moment that changed the public's understanding of what had happened at Nancy Guthrie's home. The FBI released surveillance footage recovered from a security camera at the property, and for the first time there was something concrete to look at. Not a data point or a timeline built from app disconnections and garage door logs, but an actual person caught on camera outside Nancy's front door in the early hours of the morning she disappeared. The footage showed a single figure approaching the house. The individual was wearing a black jacket, light-colored trousers, and a large pale backpack strapped firmly to their body. Their faces were completely hidden behind a ski mask, and their hands were covered with vinyl gloves. From the very first frame, this was clearly someone who had thought carefully about what they were doing and had come prepared. What the footage captured next was methodical and unsettling. The individual approached the doorbell camera and began adjusting it, clearly aware of its presence. When that did not fully block the view, they reached into a nearby plant bed, snapped off a small branch, and used it to physically cover the lens. Investigators confirmed that the person was armed, with a handgun visible in a holster across the front of their body. A flashlight was clenched between their teeth, keeping both hands free as they worked. For several days prior, investigators had believed no such recording existed. Nancy did not have an active subscription for her doorbell camera, and authorities had stated publicly that there was no saved video available. The breakthrough came through FBI coordination with private sector partners. FBI Director Kash Patel revealed the footage had been recovered using residual data stored within back-end systems. The camera bore a Nest watermark, and that detail proved crucial. Unlike most doorbell systems, Nest cameras upload short video clips to Google's cloud servers even without a paid subscription, though only temporarily. Older models store clips for roughly 3 hours, newer ones for around 6. The camera had been disabled at 1:47 in the morning on February the 1st, and Nancy was not reported missing until well after that window had expired. From the outside, the footage appeared to be gone, but deleted data is not immediately erased. The system simply marks that space as available for reuse, and until something overwrites it, fragments of the original file can still exist within the infrastructure. Recovering that data from Google's systems required engineers to locate fragments spread across servers worldwide and piece them back together manually, a process that helps explain why it took more than a week for the footage to surface. Shortly after the images were released, Savannah Guthrie shared the surveillance stills on social media, urging whoever was responsible to bring her mother home and including contact details for the FBI and the sheriff's office. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The footage had shifted the case from uncertainty to urgency, and the entire country was now looking at the same image.